As many, the chair recognizes the honorable member for the Exumas on Ragged Island.
10 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's always an honor.
Just a moment, honorable member. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Kalani.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want a clarification whether the lead speaker is speaking for 2 hours, meaning that the leader of the opposition will only speak for 1 hour. I just want to clear.
Declare that the leader.
I want to hear it with my own ear.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for the Exumas and Ragged Island.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, again. It is always an honor to stand and address this House on behalf of the great people of the Exumas.
Honorable member, did you give the clarification?
I will, Mr. Speaker. I will. Can we start again? Talk to your leader, man. Talk to your leader, government. Leader government business.
And I asked the member a question. I didn't ask my leader. I did not ask my business leader.
Why is your point of view?
I asked a question.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for Cat Island, Rumkey, San Salvador.
We appreciate that there's 2 hours allotted to one of our speakers here, and the speaker will speak, and if he uses the 2 hours, then we appreciate what that consequence will be. Right? And that is it.
So, hold on.
I will speak for 2 hours, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much.
That's the arrangement of the opening speaker.
Thank you very much.
I don't think we need to prolong that. Mr. Speaker, I am honored to stand and address this House on behalf of the great people of the Exumas and the great and long-suffering people of Ragged Island. I note, Mr. Speaker, that I do have 2 hours today, though I do hope that I will be done before then. We sat in this House last week to hear a budget communication that lasted almost 4 hours. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, it was dull. And I say again without hesitation, it was devoid of hope, provided no uplift for the Bahamian people. It was unimaginative and it was uninspiring. It engendered no confidence in the future of this administration. It had no overriding rallying theme. It lacked center. It lacked a soul. And I have to also be frank in saying that the vast majority of it, in my view, was unnecessary political rhetoric. But more on that in a bit, Mr. Speaker. When I came to this House 2 years ago, it was against the backdrop of an historic election that saw the Progressive Liberal Party suffer a great defeat and swept in a free national movement that focused much on so-called corruption and promises of transparency. I thought there was a great deal of naivety coming from the government side as it sought to demonize Bahamians as a corrupt people. I heard a lot of piggybacking and attempting to fix or enhance PLP programs. I didn't hear a lot of innovation through the discourse. But yet I was hopeful. I was hopeful that the F&M would move the nation forward as they were elected to do. I was even rooting for their success, even being in opposition. I'm a PLP, but I am a Bahamian first, a nationalist, a businessman with a family. If the Bahamas succeeds, then we all do. A rising tide, they say, float all boats. And so with some level of hope, I sat through the member of East Grand Bahamas' first budget statement in 2017, and my hope faded fast. He used that communication to deride the PLP, to claim they had done a disservice to the Bahamian people. He said the PLP ran up hundreds of millions of dollars in bills. Then he proceeded to borrow hundreds of millions of dollars in the backs of the Bahamian people. I swiftly pointed out that it was the wrong speech at the wrong time. Then I sat here again in 2018, my hopes immensely tampered, wishing I would have some semblance of sense after hundreds of millions borrowed. But my hopes were dashed again, as the minister and this administration did the unthinkable. They raised VAT on the people and tried to sell it at any cost. This administration and their operatives made nonsensical arguments about dollar devaluation and the fate of our nation, of other nations, and the possibility of losing a country because they simply couldn't manage to figure out how to run this government without causing immense harm and pain on the Bahamian people. The things they railed against the PLP for, the establishment of value-added tax, the regulation and taxation of the gaming industry, they said that these same things were the mechanism for their salvation. And only going beyond where the PLP wisely decided not to go with these measures could the Bahamian people be saved from certain doom. What we understood at the time, and now it is quite plain to see, is that the ones the people needed saving from were the members of this Free National Movement administration. Amen. It was a dangerous move, a heavy gamble. But they said they had the economic models. They said they knew what they were doing. They said they were confident they would collect the revenue and the Bahamian people could take the strain. We told them it was too steep, too soon, that it would dampen the economy, it would increase unemployment, it would inflict great pain on the Bahamian people. And now we know they were wrong and we were right. We know that because we come to this latest budget communication delivered last week and we see a pattern of non-inspiring double down, of wrong-headedness, of epic proportions. But before we get into the meat of this latest failed budget submitted to this House, let me explain something. I didn't come to this place to sugarcoat or to make friends. I came here to help. I came to contribute to a nation that has contributed so much to me. And for perspective, I was born and grew up at Forbes Hill, Little Exuma, in a level of poverty that many in this place claim to know, but surely don't always act like they've ever experienced. I was the last of 12 children, raised by a widowed mother. I had no silver spoon. I had no prospects. I had no rich uncle. What I had was a loving family, a supportive community, a nurturing village, and a government, a progressive Liberal Party government, that believed in investing in the Bahamian people. I stayed out of trouble. I studied hard. I got a scholarship, a government scholarship, to attend university, and the village helped. And through hard work and God's grace, I achieved much. And though I have given back much through my career and businesses, I found myself at a place where I saw politics as a chance to make a difference on a national scale. Now here's why I lay this out. I hear some on the other side as they constantly make reference to my wealth. They say I'm a rich man. And you will hear it again before the end of this debate. You might even hear it today. But guess what? I am not offended by it. I have earned everything I have from the ground up with sweat, struggle, and a lot of tears. I am proud of what I have achieved with the help of the Almighty and the loyalty and support of the Bahamian people. But I suppose richness and wealth, it is all relative. There are those who I could mention who benefit from a legacy of privilege, who have amassed a bounty that would make a king blush. Yet they want more. I call them special interests. The special interests in this country who are constantly protected by this government. That's right. That's right. This budget itself is a budget for special interests. This administration promised campaign finance reform in the interest of their so-called transparency and accountability.
You got 5 years, man.
And I was once again naively hopeful that with those reforms we would better be equipped to limit and expose the influence of special interests. And I came here to protect the poor and middle class from the wolves of special interests. These special interests, whom some of the other side will support by squeezing taxes from the poorest amongst us, while turning a blind eye to numerous board appointments for special interests that apparently seek to gobble the resources of this country, while displaying no consideration for the most vulnerable they represent. I came to this place to protect and do all I can to uplift the Bahamian people, create opportunities and empowerment for our youth. I came to this place to protect the struggling businessman who wants to know the pride in building something he or she can hand down to the next generation, much like those who have so much who you so unfailingly protect. I came here to empower the Bahamian people, to help break the poverty cycle, to bring solutions, if I can, to structural unemployment. That's what the PLP philosophy is about. And many who sit in here will praise the movement of a post office to Town Center Mall as a national achievement, yet fiddle while Bahamas Power and Light says one thing and does another, while still failing to provide affordable electricity and keep the lights on. I came here because I feared for this country should the wolves of special interests convince the gatekeepers they would be good protectors of the sheep. And I see now, my fear was right. Yes, this is a budget for the rich, connected, and the powerful. The special interest. Some people are protected, their fortunes jealously guarded, while others are expected to give more than they have. And there are those of us in here who will dismiss the failure of this administration to keep the lights on with an admonition to take a cowboy shower. There are those of us in here who will sit idly by and thunderously applaud the application of even more pressure to the poor and the working class, yet say nothing when asked, why do we not tax the wealthy equitably? Because clearly We give tax break to the rich in the Bahamas. We only tax the working class and the middle class. We only tax those in the struggle. But believe me when I tell you, the struggle is real. If you're one of the lucky few who made it to the clique, congratulations. It's smooth sailing from here with this government. I came to this place because I wanted to create a Bahamas for my children, Chelsea, Isaac, and Chloe. A Bahamas that they could proudly inherit. I came here because I wanted to empower Exuma and our people, and Ragged Island too. From Duncantown to Williamstown, from Forbes Hill to Farmers Hill, to Black Point, to Highburn Key, and everywhere in between. Because there are still far too many forgotten in the family islands. There's an incredible amount of work to be done inside and outside this place. And I do thank my dear wife, Cecilia, my children, and my business associates for the significant sacrifices they make on my behalf and those I represent. I came here because I saw so many who had no voice crying out, yet still being ignored, much like the people of Ragged Island, who many of you think can survive on grandiose promises by the Prime Minister. It is my sincere hope that during this budget debate, our Prime Minister will offer an apology to the people of Ragged Island for gross neglect on the part of this administration. It is my hope that this Prime Minister and the Minister of Education will articulate what the government intends to do on Ragged Island about the upcoming school year. It is my hope that there is a plan in place now, right now, for the provision of a nurse and some sort of clinic facility on Ragged Island, because there is an urgent need. These are real people with real needs that the government is not meeting. I cry and I make noise for them because their cries have clearly fallen on deaf ears. Mr. Speaker, may I now turn my attention to this failed budget. This budget is a failure. It is painfully clear that there was heavy lobbying for and on behalf of special interests, and their negotiators won. So I ask, who negotiated for the people? Because clearly, the special interests got tax breaks, and the poor and middle class got shafted once again. We see the new car dealers at it again. On top of the 25 million loss in excise tax last year, because you allowed them to bring in the cars duty-free, bonded, and only pay taxes when they sell the cars. Today, in this budget, they get even more tax breaks. In the real property tax amendments, the removal of the residency requirement for homeowners exemption for real property tax, instead of 6 months, it now just says seasonal occupancy, which could be widely interpreted and abused by rich second homeowners. This,
Honorable member, the chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
I think the member might want to be careful there, because what the amendment is seeking to do is to take that seasonal definition back to the definition that existed forever since last year. We changed it last year, but previous to that, it was the exact same definition. So we're reverting to the previous definition, and that's all we're doing here.
you made a landmark ruling this morning, Mr. Speaker, that members ought to bring up their contributions in the debate. This member had 3 hours, then 2 hours, and I believe he's wrapping up. He has another hour. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I point out that this budget, this one that we're talking about, defines seasonal as owner-occupied. This is going to cost this government, your administration, in my estimation, tens of millions of dollars. So the rich get loopholes and the poor gets crayons. Yea, it's the people's time to stock their cupboards with crayons. There's a new tax, Mr. Speaker, on currency conversion, a stamp tax, and maybe the minister can speak to this whenever he has another hour. There's a new tax of 1.5% when you exchange currency. Not only does this potentially undermine, in my view, dollar parity, but it unintentionally encourages hoarding and a black market. The exchange control regulations was amended last year to allow businesses to operate US dollar accounts. So this, in my opinion, is going to hit the poor disproportionately. In the simplest terms, as I interpret it, if a straw vendor or jet ski operator or tour operator in Exuma deposits a $100 bill US into their $B account, they would receive credit for only $98.50. So the rich get loopholes, the poor get taxed. How caring of this administration. It must be the people's time. So I will say it again. This budget is a failure. But I expect failure from a failed administration, though it does sadden me. As far as I'm concerned, this travesty of an F&M budget has not one new idea that the PLP did not leave in the pipeline. What a curious set of people we have in governance now. Always blaming the PLP for something, then claiming credit for what the PLP put in place. For instance, the Small Business Development Center, we hear this administration talking a lot about it. It was the former Minister of State for Finance, Michael Alcides, who signed a deal for its establishment of that program with the OAS. It was the PLP that determined that the SBDC, this same center, would be at the University of the Bahamas to shield it from political interference. Yet, the PLP is never mentioned when we have these success stories. I wonder what the PLP saw that this visionless government will reap credit for next. Yes, this F&M is a visionless administration that is so wildly hypocritical. There is the obvious. Taxing is the lazy way out. From the leader himself. Yes, we're not supposed to bring that up anymore. But there's also just embarrassing and shameful statements. The member for East Grand Bahama, when he was the shadow minister of finance, said VAT was like extortion. The same member for East Grand Bahama, when he was shadow minister of finance, said gaming tax was like preparing to collect blood money. You know, Google is a great thing. Google is a wonderful thing. I learned something from Google last night.
Yes.
I learned that when you are the shadow minister of finance, you keep your words soft and sweet because you never know when you're going to have to eat them. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, remember, Mr. Speaker, when the FNM said the spy bill was bad, didn't Kalani march? Would we march against it? How hypocritical. Remember when the FNM said it believed free tuition at UB? Yet, it's standing by while tuition costs significantly increase at UB. Remember when the FNM said BPL exemption would benefit 60,000? Well, the minister said it's now 79,000. What he didn't say is that the thousands of Bahamians whose lights are off don't benefit from this. Remember when the FNM said they were friends of the poor, yet gave tax breaks on caviar, new cars, planes, helicopters? How compassionate. I guess it's them people time. Remember when the member for Southern Shores promised more money for local government in his first budget speech? Yet, there's been no increase. No one else remember that, just me, I suppose. But aside from the lack, I will return to that point, Southern Shores. Aside, it ain't your fault this time. Aside from the lack of vision, the hypocrisy, the claiming of credit for other people's ideas, this budget itself falls short of the standard of a budget which should be delivered to Parliament. This failure is alarming, given the traditional apolitical stance of the Ministry of Finance in presenting fiscal numbers. The standard for budgets is included in the IMF Manual of Fiscal Transparency. Find it on Google too. And honestly, for an administration that likes to refer to the IMF so much, I find their failure to adhere to the manual when presenting the budget quite puzzling. Here's what the manual says about budget data. Budget data should reflect recent revenue and expenditure trends, underlying microeconomic developments, and well-defined policy commitments. On both counts, the government has failed. The government has inexplicably increased revenue growth trends and decreased expenditure trends without explanation. How can the government justify the withholding of payment to BPL as demonstrated in this budget for the period up to March 2019? On the non-payment of the insurance for the police, prisons officers, defense force, customs, immigration, judicial officers, as reflected in the numbers up to March 2019.
Check 317.
To ignore critical payments or adjust revenue numbers upward to meet some arbitrary deficit target is just not right, and reflects a minister and a government desperate and disconnected from the reality of the Bahamas. The government has simply ignored this basic principle and put forward a set of numbers with little or no reference to commitments already stated in the public domain. I note, for example, the apparent lack of funding for free tuition commitments at the increased levels for Bahamian students at UB. The inclusion of cruise port revenue in the revenue figures of the budget, given the government's commitment to privatize the port. The absence of any forecasting for the proceeds from the sale of Grand Lucayan, although a letter of intent is reportedly and supposedly signed. And that's just to name a few of these examples on the expenditure side. On the revenue side, it is even more alarming. The Minister of Finance, apparently, in seeking to avoid reaching the limits in his Fiscal Responsibility Act, appears motivated to make the numbers work. Why should we believe any of these revenue projections when the projections for 2019, 2017, 2018 was so far off target. The revenue numbers, in my opinion, cannot be trusted. And I don't believe them. It is unfortunate that the minister would seek to impanel a fiscal council with this failure to meet revenue targets so fresh in the minds of the public and this parliament. If the fiscal council is to have even a shred of credibility, it has no choice but to immediately dispute and reject the revenue estimates in this budget.
Chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama on a point of order.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Speaker, the member maybe needs to acquaint himself with the Fiscal Responsibility Act and what the Fiscal Council is supposed to do. And I think I want to caution that he ought not to put the Fiscal Council in the position of being considered partisan one way or the other. These are professionals that are selected, as you know, are selected by these organizations, professional organizations, and we expect them to deliver an objective opinion. So I just want to caution the member not to try to paint them in a political way or to paint them in a box, because they will issue their own comments, and we should leave that at that, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the IMF's manual on fiscal transparency, your friends, mind you, says this about revenue estimates. Realistic revenue forecasts are especially important since relatively small errors in forecasting is often difficult to adjust in response to revenue shortfalls. Revenue forecasts should be fully explained in terms of revenue trends, likely macroeconomic developments, and the estimated impact on revenue of any emergent consequences of existing tax policy and of any new tax changes. Very little of that appears to have been taken into account here. The IMF manual, our good friends, also speaks to something called internal consistency. They say cross-checks of internal consistency of fiscal data should be undertaken and the effectiveness of these procedures reported. In this case, the Minister of Finance has clearly failed. As of March 2019, the average monthly revenue was $188 million per month, leading by simple extrapolation to a projected year-end figure of $2.25 billion. The minister, without any explanation, has estimated the year-end figure to be $2.4 billion. The difference of $161 million has allowed the minister to project a year-end deficit of 1.8% rather than 3%. If he is wrong, as I contend, his budget deficit won't be $229 million, but more than $400 million on this point alone. There is no credible financial analyst. There is no junior accountant who would accept these figures at face value. So really, this is all for naught. And the credibility of this minister and the Ministry of Finance, which he heads, has suffered further damage. You know, after the minister's second budget, I introduced the concept of a credibility deficit. I'm afraid it's gotten wider. This minister is concerned about the GFS deficit, but should be more concerned about the credibility deficit. Yes, there is a significant credibility deficit. With respect to bank tax regime, the minister's treatment of the new tax regime for banks is also a little curious. I would hope this isn't the case of his famous modeling, he doesn't end up inflating the business license projected yield. Bahamian commercial banks at the moment pay business license of 3% of gross revenues and bank license fees. The bank license fees were traditionally returned to the central bank to pay for regulatory cost of supervision. The minister is proposing that this continues, but is showing this figure in a separate line, but not reducing the business license revenues by the corresponding amount. He is doing the same thing for premium tax collected by the Insurance Commission and remitted by the central government. This is now called a dividend from the Insurance Commission, which for presentation purposes has been subsumed in business license fees for several years. So the true business license number, by my calculation, needs to be reduced by at least 40 million. Therefore, I submit that business license revenues in 2019-2020 may be overstated by as much as 40 million. This, when you add to the true shortfall of this year, of what I explained is likely to be 400 million, means that next year's starting deficit without any tax adjustment would be 440 million. This is a huge amount, and unless addressed, would effectively cripple the government's operation in the coming year. You see, I'm here to help. That or this fanciful spending plan for next year will be shelved the same way they shelved the capital expense budget this year, just like it was this year, in order to hit the legally mandated deficit target. When one looked at such a startling shortfall of revenue, one would think the minister would seek to close the loopholes. He would seek to close the loopholes. He's desperately looking for revenues. He's crying everywhere that the government ain't got no revenue, and therefore the Bahamian people shouldn't expect much. And what does he do? Tax loopholes and tax breaks for the wealthy. That's what he does. That's his response to not having enough revenue. He gives up tens of millions of dollars of revenues to the rich while taxing the poor and then complaining that the government ain't got no money. Mr. Speaker, the minister covers for the failure to restart, and that's a word that's coming up fairly frequently, Mr. Speaker, F for failure. This minister covers for failure to restart the Revenue Enhancement Unit during the current fiscal year, as promised in the last budget communication, by putting forward an amendment to allow the Financial Secretary to hire contract workers to collect taxes. We heard this talk about Revenue Enhancement Unit over and over. And there's flip and flop on this Revenue Enhancement Unit. We hear it over and over. With respect to the business license tax, Mr. Speaker, and and I urge the public to read these bills. There's much in them that can be gleaned that was not included in the minister's 3+ hours budget communication. In fact, some was not included even after today, after we've added 2 more hours of the minister's explanation. With respect to business license, the creating of 4 different start and end of tax year periods for business license registration is perhaps one of the worst ideas that can be found in this budget. Why didn't the government just make it easier to pay quarterly in arrears for large businesses? That may have improved the ease of doing business. I know he's big on that. Instead, the government will likely create a compliance nightmare for itself. And this is for a tax type where you already in my view, have a compliance problem. Not satisfied with immersing just the Department of Inland Revenue in a nightmare scenario, it follows that those who compile national statistics will be dragged into this nightmare as well. And perhaps, and I would give the minister the benefit of some doubt in this area, but I know that the Department of Statistics also report falls under his ministry, and I would like to say that he is concerned about the data sources that he uses. However, Mr. Speaker, I get the impression from the current fiscal budget and the one that is being proposed that there is little concern, or not enough concern, about the reliability of statistics, in my opinion. Another example in folly, or perhaps by design, is exempting the revenue of wholly owned subsidiaries from business license once 90% of their sales is to the parent company. Speaker, this in essence is legalizing a method of some entities, such as large companies in the Bahamas, to avoid paying business license taxes. The taxes for them would now be on the margin. The difference between what they charge the final customer and their internal costs provided by their subsidiary for goods or service. Mr. Speaker, the decision to allow a taxpayer to choose a tax year for assessment would lead to a reduction in the business license tax base and ultimately in the amount of revenues collected. It would be better to decrease the rate across the board rather than create loopholes, again, loopholes for special interests. As for the exemption of revenue derived from export services for business license fees, it is clear that the minister does not fully comprehend how much revenue the large communication companies derive from foreign-based counterparts in things like roaming fees, which would now all be exempt. And speaking about the communication sector, I did not see an explanation for the 75% reduction in communication levy revenue in the budget. Nor did I see an honest explanation for making the VAT exemption for electricity permanent. An audit of the two large power companies to determine how they account for the VAT exemption would indeed be very interesting, since you like forensic audits so much. I say again, this is a budget driven by the wolves of special interests. Mr. Speaker, in the budget communication, the Speaker, the Minister, not you, Mr. Speaker, the Minister speaks of several initiatives without providing credit to the work of his predecessors. This is extremely bad taste, Mr. Speaker. Without the work done by the Minister of Finance and the Minister of State for Finance in the last Christie administration to modernize the Ministry of Finance, the country would be a lot worse off, and the present Minister of Finance would have very little to talk about in his communication, except for his failure to achieve the revenue and the expenditure budget, and perhaps elucidate about his own deficits. Since the minister won't do it, let me do it for him. I would like to thank the Right Honorable Perry Gladstone Christie and the Honorable Michael Halkitis for the new chart of accounts. Thank you. We would like to thank them for the upgrade of financial management system, inclusive of the eventual replacement of the J.D. Edwards and the SSA global system. Thank you very much. For the establishment of the Small Business Development Center, we would like to thank the former ministers and the PLP. Since we like to talk so much about the PLP, Thank you, PLP. For the establishment of the Interdepartmental Revenue Task Force, the Revenue Enhancement Unit, reporting on the Minister of Finance, we'd like to thank the PLP. Thank you, PLP. For the engagement of PwC to determine whether the Minister of Finance was fit for purpose in the modern Bahamas, we would like to thank the PLP. For the engagement of KPMG to examine public service pension reforms and the further engagement of a qualified actuary, Mr. Derek Osborne, to develop a framework for this reform, I'd like to say thank you to the PLP. I would note that this framework is currently in place for the University of the Bahamas and can be used as a model of pension reforms going forward. In short, you really don't need to hire more consultants to figure it out. The PLP already did that for you. Thank you, PLP.
Thank you. Thank you.
For the electronic single window, now it's dubbed Click to Share. That's cute. That should have been launched 2 years ago. For that, I'd like to thank the PLP. For the modernization of the property tax regime and the outsourcing collection to experienced private agency, I'd like to thank the PLP for that as well. For the new public procurement framework, let's all take a moment and say thank you to the PLP.
Everybody says thank you.
And you're welcome. And you're welcome. You're welcome. In relation to IDB dependents,
Peter said thank
the 2019-2020 budget
Peter says thanks.
also reflects an alarming reality that the government's dependence
Doc, you can't leave now. It's getting better, man.
on the IDB and now the Caribbean Development Bank to determine its development priorities for the government through the provision of funds. But strangely, this administration seemed not able to use the funds provided, as none of the active projects had any disbursements up to March 2019, which is an indication of the inefficiency of this administration in managing these programs, as the government is paying commitment fees, no doubt, on the undisbursed balances of these loans. Also, for some inexplicable reason, the government, in its proceeds from borrowing, is showing it would receive $32.5 million from the IDB for an air transport program loan, having budgeted for such, and I believe the Minister of Tourism and Aviation confirmed receipt of these funds during the fiscal year. If this is a mistake, I would recommend that the general borrowing resolution be immediately amended to account for the lack of availability of these funds. The CDB, street lighting loan, the CDB street lighting loan program was approved by the CDB in December 2018, and is now coming to Parliament almost 6 months later for approval. The government should explain why it is borrowing money to invest in infrastructure owned by BPL. On the face of it, this loan makes no sense, as BPL, the entity providing the service, is not obliged or committed to take any action. Should not the loan be made to BPL? Does the technical expertise exist within the government to run this program? Is this also designed because there's such a significant credibility deficit, Mr. Speaker? I must ask, is this also designed? Is it designed this way to cater to the wolves of special interest? Mr. Speaker, with respect to the rate reduction bond, the minister in his communication did not mention the rate reduction bond after 5 hours of talk. When he provided what he called good news about making VAT exemption on electricity permanent. This is a material point, Mr. Speaker. It's a material matter, and it warrants some commentary. I trust that he or the Honorable Minister for Works will speak to it. As I understand it, the rate reduction bond could lead to increases in electricity by at least 0.06 cents per kilowatt hour on a monthly bill this year which could be greater than 12% increase in the utility bills for BPL customers. The Bahamian people deserve an explanation. This would negate any savings. Any savings the minister spoke about the VAT exemptions for the 79,000, and for many large commercial business, this would be a fatal blow. I would have thought that the Minister of Finance would have used the opportunity of his 6-hour communication to give some relevant information as the rate reduction bond levy is for all intents and purposes a tax. You use 5, you got one more. 5 plus 1, 6. Mr. Speaker, but perhaps I ask too much. Perhaps I will get someone from the wolves of special interest to ask this question for me. In relation to tourism, Mr. Speaker, as it regards to our number one industry, the government appears to be wasting away the benefits from the opening of Bahamas and the rise of Caribbean tourism. And let me be clear, I seek not to belittle the hard work of the professionals at the Ministry of Tourism. However, no amount of self-praise is going to convince serious analysts that the Minister of Tourism hyperbolic comments about the bullish tourism numbers represents a renaissance in our product that was initiated by him. His hyperboles. He knows, Mr. Speaker. He knows, Mr. Speaker, that the boom in Caribbean tourism had very little to do with him. But it's cool to ride a wave. It's cool to ride a wave.
Give us this beneath you, man.
We know, Mr. Speaker, that he is just the luckiest Minister of Tourism ever. And we're happy for him, you know. We're happy for him. We're happy for him. And we're happy for Bahamian tourism. And we're happy for the Bahamian people. However, what he has done, Mr. Speaker, is shamelessly, in my view, sought to appropriate credit to himself that is due to others who toiled in the face of his and his party's unrelenting and mean-spirited criticism in trying to get Bahamas operational. And now, Bahamas is wonderful. Someone said it was a fake resort. They said it had a fake owner and it had a fake opening. And now it's wonderful. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the Bahamas' success is not unique. Throughout the Caribbean, countries are experiencing a rebound in numbers. Just like Jamaica, St. Lucia, Cayman, and Cuba. All these countries have seen record-breaking growth in tourism numbers. The one difference from the Bahamas that concerns me is that they have investments in the pipeline. Their investment in the pipeline is very strong, whereas we have very little investment in the pipeline in the tourist product. Other than the point, and I hear all this talk about the 8 billion.
8 billion.
Only 180, I believe, was laid out. But we do have OBAN. Well, you took record to get to that.
PMC, that's foolishness, even talk foolishness. Stop talking foolishness.
An oil refinery deal mired in confusion, conspired by convicted criminals, where allegations of corruption persist, and the police has not yet reported on the missing file. My God. Meanwhile, in Aruba, they are seeking ways to ensure that the closure of their refinery is permanent. It's about tourism. Outside of the Disney project for Saudi Lutra, there's no significant investment in the tourism product that's been announced by this government. And the point is wonderful. Thank you, PLP. If the Grand Lucayan sale that I come to was close to reality, the repayment of the so-called equity investment would have been incorporated in the budget. Yet, it is not. I can personally tell you that this drop of public and private sector investment is worrying for our future economic prospects. And this worry is compounded by this poorly prepared budget and this visionless F&M administration that does not inspire confidence in the economy. So if you have $8 billion of investment in the pipeline, don't hide it under the bushel. Tell the people. Inspire some confidence in the economy that something good about to happen for them. Because this budget is a failure. Mr. Speaker, in relation to the squandered goodwill of this government, what can be said about this administration is that it will waste no opportunity to squander goodwill and to squander favorable macroeconomic conditions. Never before have we seen a new government squander so much goodwill in such a short time. There was a window, though my fear now is that this window is closing before we can take advantage of it. That presented great opportunity. With a global economy on the rise, you had a global economy that was on the rise. You had no hurricanes in the last year. Yes. You had record-breaking tourism numbers. There was an opportunity to put the country on track for real economic expansion. Instead, this administration borrowed billions, raised taxes, and could not meet its own revenue projections. And instead of concrete explanations that make sense, we get trite, superficial platitudes laced throughout this communication, perhaps designed to camouflage this administration's incompetence. But you know what? It saddens me that the window may be closing. There are storm clouds ahead in the global economy. Central Bank, only today, says inflation could persist, and he made reference to the cost of electricity. The U.S. economic slowdown is becoming more a probability. The trade war between the U.S. and China will likely contribute to that slowdown and increase the cost of consumer goods for us in the Bahamas. And in the face of these clear and present challenges, what do we get? A budget and a minister who rearranges the furniture whilst the house is flooding. Here we go again. What's really startling about this budget communication is that one can hardly tell where politics ends and real communication begins. But I'm no longer surprised. I would though like to commend the professionals of the Ministry of Finance for the work they do. There are many good people in the public service, and they often get lumped in with the bad apples, and they sometimes take the brunt of criticisms that's designed to be held in the laps of the minister. But I dismiss the notion of those in the public service that they're not on top of their game, as I truly recognize their contribution to nation building, and I thank them. When the minister delivered his first budget communication, I said it was the wrong speech at the wrong time. The wrong speech at the wrong time. And here we go again. For instance, the government, up to the end of March, has borrowed in excess of $2.5 billion, whether for refinancing or whatever it was for. Borrowing is borrowing. No matter how many times the minister tried to stand on his feet to object and to claim that people are misleading this House, what is misleading is that in light of all this borrowing, the government only had one single paragraph on the debt on page 16 of the budget communication. And the minister did not highlight that this government, up to the end of March, has borrowed $2.5 billion. And this minister, I said $2.5 billion.
Wow.
$2.5 billion.
Wow.
Page 9 of the estimates.
Go back to what you said, though. Don't try to change
The minister also did not say in his communication, all 5 hours, that the debt to GDP ratio has increased between the end of 2016-2017 and the end of this budget period.
That's transparency now.
Where's the transparency?
Yes.
Where is it?
Where's the transparency?
Yes.
mentioned that.
Say that again.
Where's the transparency?
Yes. Where is
Say
it?
that again.
This minister stands in his soapbox for 5 hours talking about transparency and accountability. Yet he doesn't tell the Bahamian people that this
Honorable
government
member.
has borrowed $2.5 billion.
The member for East Grand Bahama on a point of order.
The member,
Just $1 billion is yours.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Exuma is in his exuberance. He is misleading this House and the Bahamian people. He said it in his initial comment with respect to the $2.8 billion that he claims was borrowed. All right, that parts of it, most of it, as a matter of fact, was it for the refinancing of existing debt, which is debt that his administration would have accumulated. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, more importantly,
Just a moment.
more importantly, Mr. Speaker, the member, hold on, I'm speaking, hold on. I got a point of order. I'm on my point of order. Mr. Speaker,
You're running out.
Mr. Speaker, I think I'm recognized. I think I'm recognized. Mr. Speaker, the more important point is, the member would know that by definition, if you have a deficit in your spending, obviously it's going to increase the debt. What do you think's happened? If you have a loan, Mr. Speaker, you earn X and you spend more than X, how is that going to bring down the debt? Just think about that for a minute. You're going to add to the debt. But the important point is, Mr. Speaker,
Thank you,
that
Honorable.
the rate of growth of that debt has slowed considerably, Mr. Speaker. That's the important point.
Thank you.
The bottom line, Mr. Speaker, the minister stands condemned by his explanation. He makes my point.
Which page? Go to the page.
Where's the transparency?
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, it's rhetorical. Mr. Speaker,
Honorable members.
I've heard it for 5 hours, Mr. Speaker. I don't wish for
Honorable members.
explanation from the minister.
Honorable members, are you on a point of order?
Unlike you, I don't do that. No, sir. You know better. It's nonsense.
5 hours, Mr. Speaker.
5 hours. And he
5 hours.
mentioned it.
He mentioned the pens, the crayons.
Yes, the crayons.
He mentioned the small refrigerator and the small stove and the ruler. And all of his colleagues banged on the table, Mr. Speaker. What I'm saying is, be accountable. Be transparent to the Bahamian people. It's your soapbox.
That's right.
Many times, over and over. Transparency this, transparency, accountability. 5 hours, Mr. Speaker. Didn't tell the Bahamian people once that this government has borrowed $2.5 billion. Didn't tell the Bahamian people once, not once, that the debt to GDP ratio has gone up.
Oh, no. It's a new era. It's a new era of accounting. New era of accounting.
So much for transparency.
New era of accounting.
So much for transparency, Kalani. So much for transparency, Kalani.
We voted against the budget.
In my opinion, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker,
We voted against it last week.
we have a Minister of Finance.
You're the one who omitted. You
We have a Minister of Finance, Mr. Speaker.
omitted. You omitted.
Mr. Speaker,
You omitted it.
Mr. Speaker, we have a Minister of Finance appointed by the member for Kalani who has a bad habit of speaking down to people. Very condescending.
Listen to him now.
He says, as an expert in the field of finance, he purports that he has more experience than any other minister of finance in the past.
He's doing well.
He's better than everybody. Yes, he's the best.
When he talks, Mr. Speaker,
Honorable member, the member for, the chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, the member suggests that I have somewhere, somehow suggested that I am the best Minister of Finance ever. Never. Never. Never, Mr. Speaker. While I am confident in what I do, I have never sought to deride, take away from the qualifications of any minister. That's not true. That is not true. I might say that their job, I could have done a better job, or somebody could have done a better job. But I've never said anything about anybody's qualifications because I know what I am. The Minister of State of Finance before me was a certified financial analyst. Now, the one before that was an economist, Mr. Speaker. So he shouldn't be in here trying to cast those kind of divisions between us. The Ministry of Finance is a difficult job. I respect them all. It is a difficult job.
Honorable
So
member.
don't try that.
Then you wind up, you'll have that sentiment.
Mr. Speaker,
I can get you communication.
Mr. Speaker,
You said it over and over.
this Minister of Finance,
I just looked at it last night.
appointed by the member for Kalani,
I looked at it last night.
has a bad habit of talking down to people.
Stop it.
You've been giving me advice all day. Here's a piece for you.
Stop it now.
In a condescending way,
Yes.
My Lord.
Mr. Speaker.
The condescension.
Lord.
And when he talks about the budget, he acts as if he is the only Minister of Finance in the history of the modern Bahamas who has any sense, who knows what he's doing. He belittles, Mr. Speaker, icons in finance, Mr. Speaker, and their contributions. Like James Smith, like your very own Sir William Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Speaker,
Adriana.
like Michael Arkitis,
Adriana.
CFA,
Eddie Honey.
and many, many others. Many, many others. Legendary financial experts in the field, Mr. Speaker.
You forget that, man.
He does it in the House,
There's always room for more.
and he does it in newspaper articles, Mr. Speaker.
Longest serving.
And though the suggestion that before he came, as he did on page 5 again, page 5, again, in his budget communication, he said that before he came, things were wildly, he said, out of control. However, Mr. Speaker, I recall budgets Mr. Speaker, where deficits were lower, but for hurricanes. I recall budgets where deficits were lower, period. Lower expenditure on much more expansive capital works programs where revenue projections were often met and sometimes exceeded. Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear, Mr. Speaker. I mentioned luminaries in the financial world who this minister seek to belittle their work. Mr. Speaker, I am being reminded, Mr. Speaker, I am being reminded that there were many other legendary nation builders who may not have been experts in the field of finance, but they just knew what they were doing. Mr. Speaker, we got to give them credit too. The Honorable Lady Hannah, the longest serving Minister of Finance. The longest serving Minister of Finance.
Former DG.
Your former Prime Minister. He had his issues in this space, but he also served as Minister of Finance.
Y'all love him now.
Hubert Ingram is his name. You remember him?
Love him now.
You remember him?
Love him now.
You remember him? And then there's Perry Gladstone Christie. And you talk about giving credit to people who serve diligently and not belittling the work of people who give national service. Let's give credit to these gentlemen who served before. And on their behalf, thank you. On their behalf. Mr. Speaker, the country has never defaulted on its debt, and it never should. Mr. Speaker,
Rolling at the convention, you know.
the Bahamas has never lost its dollar parity.
Shelby don't stop this now.
Mr. Speaker, the Bahamas has grown economically, though not fast enough in my opinion. All before this current Minister of Finance came into office. All before he arrived. These things happened, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
And I suspect, Mr. Speaker, that we'll be just fine when he is no longer Minister of Finance.
Yes.
After the next election, Mr. Speaker. Time is indeed longer than rope, Mr. Speaker. We have a Minister of Finance who talks about new tax categories. And his colleagues. But what he didn't dissect for you is the increases in taxes within the existing categories. No new tax categories. That's cute. It's very cute. But where is the transparency, Mr. Speaker? I note that this government went to great pain to say it wants to increase the ease of doing business. But the Ease of Doing Business Committee, in yesterday's Guardian, is saying how very disappointed they are in this government because they didn't do nearly enough. The government says it wants to build a 21st century infrastructure as a new foundation for growth. I honestly don't see where this is being done or how it's being reflected in this budget. I trust we don't mean the road paving the Prime Minister announced in his national address. I don't think that's going to cut it. The government says it will invest in education to break the cycle of poverty. And I'm not saying that's not being attempted to be done, but I don't see it laid out where meaningful steps are being made in this regard. The minister went to great pains today to talk about the abandonment of the RISE program. I wish the member for Engliston was here to hear this. He was talking about the abandonment of the RISE program and how there was some reallocation. When we look at the estimates for social services, urban renewal, and the Department of Social Services. And we add it all up, and we compare it, we find that this budget cuts the overall budget for this ministry and this department by almost $1.3 million. So no amount of gyrations, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable
No amount of gyrations is going to explain this.
It's on a point of order.
No gyrating.
The chair recognizes the honorable member
You
for
can deal with it.
East
Mr.
Grand
Speaker,
Bahama.
the Minister of National Security, of Social Services says he'll deal with it. But I just want the public to know that is a mistruth. It is not true. It's untrue.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I invite, and if I may have a few minutes, to address this, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, he has accused me, he's accused me of an untruth, Mr. Speaker.
He got to defend himself.
I urge this minister to familiarize himself with his own estimates.
Yes, go and study your numbers.
I invite this minister
Go to page.
to go to page 134 of page 245, and I want him, Mr. Speaker, if he will indulge me, to go to the very bottom line, and I invite him to compare his budget for 2018-2019. Mr. Speaker, my time is running. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I've been accused. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, respectfully, Mr.
Honorable member,
Respectfully,
the chair has not made an issue.
No, respectfully, Mr. Speaker, respectfully. This minister has accused me of an untruth. And I'd like some leeway in responding to that, Mr. Speaker, if it pleases you. If it pleases you, Mr. Speaker. I invite this minister to go to the last line on page 134 in his estimates, his book. And when he compares, if he will, the budget, the approved estimates, 2018-2019 versus 2019-2020, the budget for the upcoming year is cut by $600,000 compared to the budget for last year, Mr. Speaker. And then, Mr. Speaker, I encourage the minister I think I've made the point, Mr. Speaker. I think I've made the point.
That should be struck from the record.
I will conclude that point by encouraging the Minister of Finance
To read his own document.
to familiarize himself with
His own document.
a lot of hard work gone into this by the people at the Ministry of Finance, you know. The one thing I would say about this budget, the hard-working staff of Ministry of Finance clearly would have gone through a significant level of work. A significant level of work, Mr. Speaker, to put this all together.
So what you saying?
The least the minister could do, Mr. Speaker, is familiarize himself with it. He should read it, Mr. Speaker. He should read
The
it.
second time we'll question him read the budget.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the government says he wants to invest in renewable energy. I won't expand on that. I believe the Honorable Minister of Works hopefully will shed some light on this, I hope. But renewable energy. This government seems not to know where it's coming or going. They talk about this renewable energy plunge and Mr. Speaker, Ragged Island, 2 years later, still waiting for his green city, Mr. Speaker. Meanwhile, Mr. Speaker, the government doesn't plan to get serious about renewables in the Family Islands, the most practical place to start, Mr. Speaker, because 170 million in my estimation, Mr. Speaker, simply won't cut it. Mr. Speaker, Again, in relation to the Small Business Development Center. Mr. Speaker, I support this program without hesitation. Mr. Speaker, I believe it's a step in the right direction to transform for his vision and his foresight. And I'd like to thank the current minister for not stopping or reviewing or abandoning this program, Mr. Speaker.
Coming back to your job?
Mr. Speaker, it's not as well resourced as it could be, Mr. Speaker.
They clap for you, you know.
The impact in the overall economy in the short term can be more, Mr. Speaker. But I do applaud the successes. Amongst the persons benefiting, Mr. Speaker,
At least the money was there.
is Kaniqua Burrows.
It was there.
Kaniqua Burrows, Mr. Speaker, of Exuma, a passionate educator and a former teacher of the year at Ellen Coakley High School. You know her. She stepped out on faith to open the Exuma Christian Academy. Kaniqua was intent on blazing new trails in education, a very difficult space. I have no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that she will do well. And I offer best wishes to her. I offer my full support as I've demonstrated in the past. I believe, though, Mr. Speaker, there are more Kaniquas out there. However, the $25 million allocated over 5 years by this administration, in my view, it's not enough. A PLP administration will dedicate at least $250 million over 5 years to the development of small and medium-sized businesses in his next term in office. That's how serious we take this sector. That's how serious we take this sector. We mean business. This is serious business. We understand. We understand.
10 times as much.
We understand that it is the driver of economic growth and empowerment. It is the driver of job creation. So why wouldn't we do it? I also believe, Mr. Speaker, that the F&M should commit to listing in full the grants and the funding made available through the SPDC. There was a list of the loans. There was a list of the loans, but there were no lists of the grants. After all, this is the government transparency, and we want to know who this government granting money to, Mr. Speaker. It's as simple as that. We want to know who this government is granting money to. So produce the list. In relation to infrastructure, the government says it wants to build a 21st century infrastructure as a new foundation. I honestly don't see how. I honestly don't see the commitment to doing so, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government, this F&M government, this administration has been dithering. It's been fiddling as opposed to being focused. What the F&M has done a great deal of dithering and fiddling. For example, the F&M stopped and canceled and review 2.0 lead to at least 15-month delay. Mr. Speaker, the delays at BPL contributed to at least a 15-month delay, and what I am told would average cost the Bahamian people $10 million per month. But I know the good minister will speak to that, so I won't belabor the point. But what I'm saying, I made 2 points today. The rate reduction loans can cause the electricity to go up, And I'm saying today, there's $10 million extra per month going on that ought not to have been going on, and it needs to be addressed, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I skipped a few pages on BPL. I'm sure that the shadow minister and the leader of the opposition will deal with BPL issues, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the F&M dithering led to disruption of the post office opening, ending in a windfall to a minister and an eyesore on a heavily trafficked highway. The F&M's dithering and fiddling has led to delay in completion of a baseball stadium, meaning millions of dollars in cost overruns. The F&M's dithering and fiddling has led to increased interest due to a failure to pay legitimate debts on time. And yeah, I hear the minister talking about old bills. The F&M's dithering and witch hunts has led to millions of dollars in so-called forensic audits, many of which we've gotten no reports. Of course, this supposed transparent government won't reveal even the cost of these audits. Where is the transparency? So much talk about old bills, still finding bills, the minister says, under every nook and cranny, he says. This after borrowing billions of dollars. This is after increasing taxes massively. What I find interesting, though, is that he has not disputed these bills that he has included in previous budget. By not paying them, Mr. Speaker, I do not find, Mr. Speaker, the moral authority for not paying them, Mr. Speaker, for having not paid them, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this minister accepted the concept of continuous government. So where is the morality in still having not paid the bills that he claimed were there 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker? This administration is to be condemned for having not paid these bills, Mr. Speaker. Should they not be paying these on a first in, first out basis, Mr. Speaker? I don't quite comprehend where the morality in all of this is, Mr. Speaker. Let me repeat the context of this point. This minister, after borrowing billions, after increasing taxes massively, he still hasn't paid the people, Mr. Speaker. He still hasn't paid the people. Pay the people, Mr. Speaker.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama on the point of order.
The member's on a roll and all of that, right? But he should again tell the truth, all right? We paid $127 million up until the end of April on $172 million that we promised the Bahamian people we would pay. We are on the path to paying those bills. The member is well aware that you cannot find that kind of cash just to pay. So you have a plan, a payment plan, if you want to call it that, a slow 50, right? That you pay it off on time. That's what we do. And these bills are not new bills. These weren't just didn't come up. These are bills that go back years, Mr. Speaker, years. That their administration did nothing with. We are at least addressing it. And with a dedicated plan.
Please. Mr. Speaker, the member is now approaching 6 hours of talk time, Mr. Speaker. 6 hours, Mr. Speaker. 6 hours, Mr. Speaker. I have not dissected the expenditure numbers as yet. And time may not allow me, Mr. Speaker. But here's what I will say. On the revenue side, I projected that because of the shortfalls that's imminent, in my opinion, this deficit is going to be in the region of $400 million based on revenue shortfalls alone. Now let me speak to the expense side. So I don't want to shortchange this deficit. Mr. Speaker, there are contractors and vendors and mailboat operators. Mr. Speaker, lunch vendors, Mr. Speaker, lunch vendors who have not been paid. So, Mr. Speaker,
The chair recognizes honorable member for South Beach on a point of order.
I just wish the honorable member of Exuma, who remains my hero, Mr. Speaker, despite this rhetoric, to kindly assist the Ministry of Education in providing names of those who have not been paid.
Speaker, I will do so. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education, the member for South Beach, has been very responsive, Mr. Speaker, on various issues, and therefore I will gladly provide him with the details. Mr. Speaker, the point I was making, though, is that when we tally these expenses, when we tally these expenses in October and November, because we comparing like with like,
Yes.
you know how we do it?
That free time.
Compare like with like,
Tell Freetown, yes.
we will understand the true nature
Yes.
of the amount of expenses,
Yes.
and it is my view, Mr. Speaker, it's my view
Tell Freetown.
that this 229 million, Mr. Speaker,
Go to what?
as I Googled, Mr. Speaker, I love Google. Mr. Speaker, I like Google. The minister who was the shadow minister of finance referred to something, he said, it's like pigs flying. I thought that was cute. Mr. Speaker, with his permission, I'd like to borrow that line. Mr. Speaker, the minister's $229 million deficit is like pigs flying, Mr. Speaker. When we factor in the revenue shortfalls, when we factor in, Mr. Speaker, when we factor in the real expense numbers, October, November, Mr. Speaker, this 229 million will be like pigs flying. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, in relation to BTC, this is important because you've condemned your Prime Minister. You've condemned your Prime Minister. This is important. You want to hear this because you condemned your Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, in relation to BTC, in relation to BTC, let me explain. In relation to BTC,
Yeah.
perhaps I'm reading it incorrectly, but this government's approach to the BTC pension liability seems to be an admission that the BTC deal was a bad one.
It is.
But this was an F&M deal, remember? In the last F&M government.
Kalani did that.
The current Prime Minister,
Now it continues.
the member for Kalani,
He opposed that.
sat in that cabinet
Yes.
Yes,
that approved this bad deal.
and agreed with it 100%.
Can we finally admit that the F&M effectively gave BTC a sweetheart deal for $210 million, and now they're sending some money back. They're sending some money back, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Finance, I misspoke, Mr. Speaker, Cable and Wireless. I misspoke. The Cable and Wireless deal. The Minister of Finance is effectively condemning the Prime Minister, who sat in the cabinet and was a party to that bad deal. I do thank the Minister of Finance for this,
Defense of it since then too.
for validating the point that the PLP has been making all along. Further, Mr. Speaker, the liability continues to grow every day. The pension issue is not addressed. It grows exponentially. And Mr. Speaker, here's the point. And I believe the minister conceded this point. but it bears repeating. Here's the point. Without a definitive, comprehensive strategy, this will be an ongoing problem for the government of the Bahamas that might see the return of the $210 million that Cable and Wireless paid. How entirely sad is this? How entirely sad, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, in relation to the real estate tax changes, Mr. Speaker, in relation to the real estate tax changes, I invite the Honorable Minister to broaden his scope of consultation. Because I am advised, Mr. Speaker, that many developers and people in this industry who understand how this works very well, how it impacts their lives, how it impacts their businesses, their ability to grow and employ people, have not been consulted, Mr. Speaker. There appears to have been no broad consultation. I've spoken to several realtors who said they had no idea these changes were coming in relation to real estate taxes, etc. Speaker, I just, it wasn't.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for Eastern Bahamas on a point of order.
So I don't know who the member would have spoken to, but I had in consultation with the president and the vice president of the Bahamas Real Estate Association, along with some other members. So I don't know who he is speaking about. Real Estate Association. So they were definitely there, and they gave their input. So I don't know who he would have spoken to, but I want to put that on the record for clarity.
Mr. Speaker, I was hopeful when the minister said at the beginning of his presentation that he consulted widely. So I was disappointed in hearing this, and therefore I'm grateful that the minister is now explained, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's something very curious about this ability to transfer land without incurring stamp tax, Mr. Speaker. There's something curious about it. And Mr. Speaker, it seems like something that the poor won't, or the middle class, or regular working people wouldn't necessarily benefit from in any meaningful way, Mr. Speaker.
But they can, right?
I see where he's going, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, but, you know, it makes me wonder, after all that I've said so far, whether this government is once again catering to special interests, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it bothers me. It bothers me, Mr. Speaker.
People don't have land.
In relation to Grand
Before black and
Lukai, Mr. Speaker, in relation to Grand Lukai, in relation, Mr. Speaker, Bahamian people don't trust this FDM administration anymore. They don't trust this FDM administration anymore. So, Mr. Speaker, even when, Mr. Speaker, even when the government try to explain that they're doing some good for the people see special interests, Mr. Speaker. That's what the people see. I'm here to speak on behalf of the people, Mr. Speaker. And now let me speak in relation to Grand Lukai. I know there's nothing substantive in the budget communication on Grand Lukai. I'm not sure the minister said anything about it today either. I know this administration was hoping that we would all forget about this perhaps, but that's not going to happen. The government is still in a state of delusion on booking this investment. As I said before, they're booking it as an investment, Mr. Speaker, the full amount. We paid out cash. We incurred debt through a mortgage with Hutchinson to essentially nationalize a hotel that's losing money that we acquired, I am told, for significantly more than the appraised value, Mr. Speaker. And any junior accountant will tell you, Mr. Speaker, that if you buy something for $65 million and it's only worth $50 million, just an example, the $15 million is an expense. And it affects your bottom line. It affects your deficit, Mr. Speaker. And if you're losing money and you keep pumping money in, It's an expense
I can leave that
that impacts your bottom line, Mr. Speaker. The minister understands this. He understands this full well, Mr. Speaker. The sale is nowhere near imminent, as far as I know, and will not be complete by the end of this fiscal year. Much of it is an expense, plain and simple. Back to that pig flying deficit of 229 million, Mr. Speaker. As are the funds associated with running this hotel, Mr. Speaker, it all adds up as an expense. Mr. Speaker, the tax breaks are massive, Mr. Speaker. I note that the Minister of Finance touted certain tax breaks in his budget communication, and I can't help but talk about them once more. I regard some of these, Mr. Speaker, as window dressing, gimmicks, designated to distract from the pain of carrying on the massive VAT hike. And I hope the Minister of Health will inform the Minister of Finance that the people cannot eat pens, crayons, pencils, rulers, and construction paper. I trust that he will, Mr. Speaker. This is a Crayola budget, Mr. Speaker. That's what this is. And that's fine if you want to save parents 50 cents on a box of crayon. You want to save parents 50 cents on a box of crayon. But how about taking the pressure of them with regard to their light bill, the thousands whose light bills are? Is this Crayola budget? The smaller refrigerators and stoves are now reduced, Mr. Speaker, in this Crayola budget. Well, you're rich, F&M friends, don't buy these things, certainly not in any measurable quantities. And the people who live in spaces where these small refrigerators can fit struggle to afford them, Mr. Speaker. As I said, Mr. Speaker, gimmicks in this Crayola budget, Mr. Speaker. Now taking duty of musical instruments, taking duty. East Grand Bahama. I found something good. I found something good in this budget, East Grand Bahama. Taking duty of musical equipment and commercial trailers is something I applaud. Yeah. Yeah, you did that too. Read your book, man. Read your book. Read your book. Read your book. Yeah, read your. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yes. Now. Yes. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. I take the point. Trailers for commercial fishermen. Trailers for commercial fishermen. Again. But I said that was good. Mr. Speaker. Banning plastics and styrofoams, Mr. Speaker. I have no fundamental issue with, Mr. Speaker.
You can't move again, man.
But on my way back to Parliament after lunch, Mr. Speaker, and I want the Minister to hear us. I want the Minister for the Environment, who I know is watching this on the parliamentary channel, to hear this.
Yes.
I received a call on the way back to Parliament today from a young entrepreneur who operates in the plastics business.
What he said? Tell them what he said.
She hires almost 20 people,
Oh my God.
and she is distraught that in 6 months' time, 6 months' time,
Tell them free down.
6 months' time,
Yes.
she will be virtually out of business. She is further concerned, Mr. Speaker,
Yes.
that the replacement for the traditional products being used will increase the cost of living.
Oh.
Mr. Speaker, I just invite this administration to look carefully at these concerns. Mr. Speaker, this young entrepreneur doesn't necessarily find the banning of plastics offensive, you know. She recognizes that the world is going in that direction, but she also recognizes that there are some challenges with countries who banned plastics, Mr. Speaker. The Philippines, for example, have banned plastics, and they have made some efforts to reverse it because they experienced some challenges.
Yes.
My only suggestion to this government, Mr. Speaker, not just on the issue of putting people out of business, but give this some more time. Carefully consider what we are doing, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we are not harming the small man with unintended consequences. Fundamentally, though, Mr. Speaker, styrofoams and plastics, again, I trust, Mr. Speaker, with the increase in the level of cancers and exumas and across the Bahamas, I trust that there will be some studies going on in this area. I hope the Minister of Health and the Minister of Environment can speak to these issues. And don't say I never said anything nice about your Crayola budget, because, Mr. Speaker, I could get with some of these kinds of initiatives. For the spirits and beer amendment, however, there's a curious one.
Okay, this one, okay.
There's a curious one.
Analyze this one.
It's for microbreweries.
That shares in the...
Microbreweries. That's cute. Microbreweries. I would like to know, before this debate is out, who will truly benefit from this?
That shares.
Will the minister responsible inform this House that this is not inspired by the wolves of special interest? And then, there's the permanent exemption, Mr. Speaker, that I spoke of earlier, so I won't speak to that. But Speaker, we have duty reductions on new cars from 65 to 45. Mr. Speaker, I spoke to that earlier. And again, I am very concerned as to the influence on this budget, Mr. Speaker, by special interests. There's a budget for special interests, Mr. Speaker. Special interests, Mr. Speaker. Special interests. That's what this budget is about, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in relation to Exuma, Mr. Speaker. In relation to Exuma, it has been well established that the people of Exuma are proud people. Mr. Speaker, we don't beg. We don't beg. And we don't like handouts, Mr. Speaker. We like to earn our keep. But we do expect fairness, Mr. Speaker. We want to receive basic fairness. And Mr. Speaker, I almost fell off my chair, Mr. Speaker, when I read in this budget that there are proposed cuts to the Exuma local government allocation by 33%. 33%. The member for Southern Shores, who was the minister at the time, assured the people of Exuma that this administration believed in fairness. Exuma was generating great amounts to the treasury, and Exuma should have a percentage of what they bring in.
God knows could never let that happen.
But they reduced the allocation. They reduced the allocation.
Look in the book and talk for this.
They reduced the allocation
Talk about it in the book, man.
from 530,000
Show that in the book.
530,000
Show it in the
to
book.
360,000. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I invite the Minister of Finance to familiarize himself with the estimates in Annex 7. If he goes down to line 151, he will see on page 230,
230.
he will see that for Exuma, it was 530,000 for 2018, 2019.
Let God be great.
And for the year 2019, 2020, it's 360,000.
Let Ezra them in that black and
I
black.
wanted Exuma here and that today.
Mr. Speaker,
Black point. Him and
No,
Henry.
victimizing Exuma, man.
Mr. Speaker,
Let Penelope great him and Stanley Key.
the minister says he was not aware of this, Mr. Speaker,
Victimizing.
and I trust it's a mistake. But it's in the estimates. And this is disgraceful, Mr. Speaker. This is disgraceful. It's disgraceful, Mr. Speaker. It's disgraceful. Local government, I believe, Mr. Speaker, has made a pitch for $1 million And they made it for good reason, Mr. Speaker. I'm talking about mainland Exuma. Mr. Speaker, I'm talking about mainland Exuma. I directed the minister to line 151. He knows very well what I'm saying. He saw the number. It's 530 last year. It's 360. The numbers, these are not your numbers, Mr. Speaker. These are his numbers.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand
Your
Bahama
numbers, man.
on the point of order.
We will go head to head on these numbers during the appropriate stage.
Yeah.
But I just want to encourage the member to look at the number that was, the amount that was spent for the year. And that would give him a reference point as to why the number is what it is.
Mr. Speaker, this is disgraceful. Mr. Speaker, Exumas, I'm talking about mainland Exuma, it's growing rapidly, and the Keys, also true for the Keys, in terms of the economy and its population. Great Exuma alone, Mr. Speaker, is 44 miles. The Central Bank noted in its February data that the number of room nights sold in Exuma grew by 46% compared to just under 22% for New Providence. Also, the total number of room nights sold for the year increased in Exuma by 55.9% compared to the previous year. Why then would you cut the local government budget for mainland Exuma? Why?
Shame.
This is simply foolish, Mr. Speaker. We should be investing in the revenue generating sector of our economy. Exuma is bringing revenues, why not invest, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, I sincerely hope this is, I hope this is a mistake, Mr. Speaker. But this is the only line, that's changed, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, again, I am doubtful, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, they've cut the allocation by 25%. I think it's wicked. I think it's a spiteful act by this government. And I assure them that they will be held to pay for it, Mr. Speaker. And I can't imagine, Mr. Speaker, why this administration, why would you want to undermine the credibility of the people who volunteer to serve? Why? Except to score cheap political points, Mr. Speaker, at the expense of the people. At the expense of the people who pay taxes, Mr. Speaker. This ain't your money, you know. It's not your money. It's the people's money.
Honorable member for Exuma, the member for East Grand Bahama.
I think the member may be being a little premature. I do recognize that there is a budget reduction in the budgeted amount. As I've said before, you ought to look at the amount of money that was actually spent in the district, which I believe is instructive.
That's nonsense.
But I would ask him to allow me to have a talk with the budget team about that particular number.
Mr. Speaker,
With that particular number.
Mr. Speaker, I accept the minister's undertaking.
Because one thing that this government and this minister does not do is discriminate or play petty politics with people. And so if it is a mistake, we'll have to address it. But I suspect, Mr. Speaker, that there was probably an over-budgeting in the previous year, and we're now adjusting it to the reality. Okay? Again, if the expenditure, the actual expenditure,
Honorable member,
had exceeded,
trying to give you an explanation that could assist you.
yeah, if it had exceeded the amount that we had budgeted, then he would have a legitimate point. But I'm fairly confident that we are budgeting according to the amount that is actually allocated to that district.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, honorable member.
Respectfully, Mr. Speaker, I will allow the minister to look into the matter and to find out the real answer, Mr. Speaker, because the answer that he's given is not acceptable to me, and it's not acceptable to the Bahamian people. It's not acceptable to the people of Exuma, Mr. Speaker, and therefore I will accept his undertaking to look into this matter, Mr. Speaker. I'll accept that, Mr. Speaker, and no doubt we will continue the discussion. But I assure you, Mr. Speaker, the professionals of local government in Exuma and the people of Exuma are not pleased with what the minister describes as maybe a sleight of hand, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member. The chair recognizes the honorable member.
Please, I'm going to ask him respectfully to withdraw that.
Speaker, I withdraw the point. And I move on. I accept his undertaking to look into the matter. I do not accept his current explanation. But the minister, I'm grateful that he's taken it on to look into it. Mr. Speaker, I will return to this issue, no doubt, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, the public has lost hope in this F&M government. The public has lost hope in this government. The public has lost hope, Mr. Speaker. What is telling about this budget is that in terms of the general public, there's been very little discussion about it, Mr. Speaker. People have tuned this administration out. We talk about it in this place, and it indeed is important, but the people no longer care what this government say, Mr. Speaker. This is because the F&M and the Minister of Finance have failed to connect this budget to everyday people's lives. People no longer view the F&M as a factor in bettering the life of Bahamians. They now view the government as covetous of their money and blindly devoted to having clean books and numbers, but dismissive of the need to foster an environment of prosperity. Because of this government's assault on the people, most who work very hard for a living don't expect anything but inconvenience and hardship, Mr. Speaker. This uncaring F&M administration has put the numbers before the people. And the people have come to believe that the politicians care more about the affairs of government, the ability to borrow at better terms and decrease deficit, than the very lives of the people. What about the people? Are reduced debt and moving away from deficit spending and paying less in debt servicing important? Yes, of course. They're important, absolutely. But with these past three budgets, the government has failed to resonate and speak to the needs of the Bahamian people. Because when it speaks, it only speaks about itself. The minister talks about how well the government has done for itself. Yeah, how great thou art. But it has done it at the expense of the people. The minister has failed to connect the affairs of government to economic growth for Bahamians. This is because the truth is, the F&M is doing the opposite with its practices. Its policies are harmful. It is in fact hindering economic growth. Government should never place...
Honorable member, the chair recognizes the member for Eastern Bahamas on a point of order.
Again, Mr. Speaker, the member is misleading. He may want to make a point, but he cannot make a point to say that this government has not looked out for the people, or that the policies of this government has not helped the development of the economy. As I mentioned earlier this morning, 3,700, in excess of 3,700 businesses have been licensed, Mr. Speaker, which translates to people, Mr. Speaker, making money and employing people, Mr. Speaker, economic activity that did not exist before, Mr. Speaker. The economy itself grew 1.6%, Mr. Speaker. That means people, services, goods are being transacted. It means people are making money, Mr. Speaker. I know the member knows better than that.
Mr. Speaker, my stopwatch says that the minister talked now for 6 hours and 10 minutes, Mr. Speaker. 6 hours, 10 minutes. And I submit, Mr. Speaker, that his policies, in my opinion, are hindering economic growth. And nothing that he says, if he speaks for another 6 hours, can change that opinion. Because I have done my assessments, and that's what I have determined. Government should never place its own welfare above that of the people who fund it, whom it exists to serve. This is a cardinal sin. It's an affront to democracy. A budget communication, particularly one that takes more than 3 hours, should do much more than lay out the numbers. It should chart a path forward for the people. What about the people? Hidden in the figures in context is context that a minister should be able to communicate what's in it for the people, and he has failed to do so, Mr. Speaker. A government should not cause its people unnecessary pain. And this budget, over the past several years, this administration has caused pain on the Bahamian people. That's what this government's done. It has pulled money out of the economy for its own selfish reasons. The government's now, in essence, competing with the private sector for Bahamian disposable income. That's what they're doing. The minister referred to this as extortion when he talked about back a couple of years ago. And the Prime Minister, member for Kalani, referred to it as the lazy way out, he said. Bahamian people will never forget that. You've hurt the Bahamian people with this approach. It is startling that you can't see it. The missed targets, the lack of robust economic growth, the inability to make any meaningful impact on unemployment. Unemployment's up. You make an impact? The economy is growing? Growing for who? Unemployment is up. You had 1.6% growth. I accept that. There's no need for me to dispute that. You projected 2.5. You had a perfect set of scenarios, and you've squandered it. That's what you've done. You've squandered a perfect set of scenarios. You've squandered the goodwill of the Bahamian people. You've squandered the goodwill of this economy, Mr. Speaker, and that's why you're underperforming. A PLP government will ensure, Mr. Speaker, the PLP government will ensure, Mr. Speaker, that the people feels the budget. The PLP government will ensure that there is more money in more pockets. But you've only made things worse. To pay off the bills incurred by the PLP, you say, what a petty and a vindictive reason to put your Bahamian people through so much pain. You put your politics before people, Mr. Speaker. And I doubt very much they will forget it. What would have been appreciated by Bahamians would have been some sort of vision for opening up our economy. But it's expected that this administration would wash its hands off any responsibility to foster sound economic growth and environment. I would have liked, Mr. Speaker, I would have liked to have the government moving forward on legislation to decriminalize small quantities of marijuana and legalize medicinal cannabis. Let's focus on the latter. The latter will harness new industries, create jobs and opportunities, while we dither and we fiddle. I would have been interested to hear a real plan for BAMSI to reduce our dependence on foreign foods and get more Bahamians into local organic farming. I would have liked to have heard a real push towards reducing energy costs. Make no mistake, no one is fooled by what I believe is clear gambit for the special interest to take out claims for energy production and distribution in this country. Mr. Speaker, we need to hear more. Perhaps we could have heard of broader investments in national insurance for the construction of preschools and daycare centers so that more women who had recently given birth could re-enter the workforce. I know you're bankrupt of new ideas. I know. I'm telling you now that this thing you call terra firma, you heard about terra firma? I heard about terra firma. This thing you call terra firma, or whatever you choose to call it, irrespective of the fact that you're bankrupt of new ideas, this ain't gonna cut it. This is a non-starter. And the day this administration believes that the Bahamian people will allow you to transfer government-owned buildings owned by the Bahamian people to some company that will benefit special interests that will be held to pay in this country, be warned. Be warned. I know you're bankrupt with new ideas, but don't come with this one. Don't come with this one. For the love of country. It would have been nice to hear about a broad investment in public transport for New Providence, but alas, we didn't hear that. What I see is a budget that has little to do with people and more to do with international agencies. The Minister of Finance claims that no international agencies dictate to the government of the Bahamas. I respect that. Do I fail to understand the difference when the result is the same? Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, does the IMF or the Minister of Finance, for that matter, understand that for many Bahamians, we saw ourselves surpass our parents in education, in home ownership, in business ownership, in investment and achievement? However, Mr. Speaker, this generation is hurting, Mr. Speaker. This generation that we see before us in the aftermath of the Great Recession is faced with the prospects of achieving less than the generation before, Mr. Speaker. And that concerns me, Mr. Speaker. I see that the Minister of Education agreed with the University of the Bahamas study that said our men who are in prison for violent crime are disproportionately high school dropouts. I like that study. What are we doing about this? Why we come here and we laugh, we bang on the tables? That's a legitimate question. Will we continue to allow our boys to fail out of system at such an alarming rate? I would rather change the system in its entirety before we let that happen. Yet, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, they cut the budget for social services by 1.3 million. And Mr. Speaker, they cut the budget, this is your estimates, they cut the budget for youth, sports and culture by $5.3 million, Mr. Speaker, when you look at the bottom line totals, Mr. Speaker. And I urge the minister to familiarize himself with this book, his very own estimates. So, we're cutting social services, we're cutting youth, sports and culture. Yay! It's the people's time. Who is going to invest in the people? Who will fight for the people? Who? Who has negotiated for the people? You went into negotiation with special interests, clearly, and special interests won. Who is going to speak on behalf of the people? What about the people? Who's going to speak for the people? Where's the conscience in this F&M administration? Who is going to speak for the people, Mr. Speaker? Do we stand by while the dreams of those who come after us slip further and further because we're not focused on the people? Or do we get serious about the impacting the lives of our people? Are we going to continue to make arrogant remarks about the Prime Minister governing for 10 years while his plans... Are we going to continue to do that while he plans his political future? What about the people? Are you going to plan his political future and squander the 5 years the people have given you to impact the lives of our people? What about the people? Or do we get desperate about the situation that exists today? What Bahamas will he, in his mind, govern for another 8 years? One where children continue to have little or no hope. One where parents in the Bahamas today decide between paying the mortgage, if they're lucky enough to get one, and putting food on the table. What Bahamas does this government want to leave in place? One in which it can brag about some checklist it completed, or one in which people see more opportunities. One in which it can brag about what they did for the powerful and the connected and the special interests. Someone, at some point, should wake up and focus on economic growth for the people. Growth for the people. Creating a more progressive and prosperous Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, a PLP government will build a nation that our children will be proud to inherit. Connecting all Bahamians, grounded in the wisdom of the past and harnessing the creativity of the present to develop a future where our youth can have aspirations to own our economy. Not only to have jobs, although the jobs are important, but to own our economy and to own our new industries. Mr. Speaker, the people of Exuma and the people of Ragged Island, the long-suffering people of Ragged Island, are grateful for this opportunity that I've had to speak on behalf of the people. Someone has to speak for the people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May God